come to listen to a couple of talks in particular. The lecture capture talk from Denny DeRay, Alison Reed and Karen Noble is not taking place in here. Neither is the host of Wikimedian in Residence. So the two talks that we've got is the first one, the iPilot project, which Matt Elphick is going to talk about first. And then we have Liz Ellis and Alice Gallagher talking about digital connectors or digital as a distraction. So just in case you had planned to attend a specific one, just to let you know ahead of time. Not that we expect anyone to leave, because we're sure we've still got two fantastic talks coming. So I'd like to invite Matt up first. Come and take the stage.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Matt Elphick, and I am the TEL Research Officer at the University of Winchester. And I'm here to talk to you about a project that I've been running for the last 2 years called the iPilot. This is a project where we've been looking to embed the use of mobile devices into the classroom to see whether it promotes student creativity, it promotes their ability to collaborate with their peers, and also kind of increases their digital literacy skills as well. Now, this was a project that was proposed by Learning and Teaching Development, which is the department that I work for, as well as our student union, and it comes off the back of a number of other projects. So a number of years ago, we were involved in Fast Tech, which looked to use technology as a way of overcoming problems with assessment. And after that, we also had a staff mobile device scheme at the university, where staff members were given devices, and they were also paired with students who are experts with digital technologies, to see whether these devices could help improve their working lives. So the iPilot scheme was open to all undergraduate programs at the university to apply to be a part of. We had 9 applicant programs, and we invited 8 of those to come to interview. And at the interview, they had to present how they were going to use these devices in the classroom in front of a panel that consisted of members of Learning and Teaching team, as well as our student union, and also one of our deputy vice-chancellors. Off the back of these interviews, we accepted 7 programs onto the pilot, and we had a really broad mix of programs involved, which is a really good thing for us. So we had some quite large courses with, say, 200 students a year, down to some very small courses with only, say, roughly 20 students in a cohort. We also had a really varied mix of teaching practices as well. We had some which were quite traditional and very lecture-based, some which were very workshop-heavy, others where their students spent a lot of time actually away from the university on placement, and others still where they spent a lot of time in science labs. So we had a really broad mix of programs and disciplines from across 3 of the 4 faculties at the university. And this project began in 15-16, and we ran it again last year in 16-17. And so the first year students who joined these programs, after they'd enrolled, they were given an iPad Mini 2 and a case as a gift from the university to use as part of their studies. The staff who were teaching them were also provided with a device, and they were also given some basic training on how they can go about embedding these devices into the way that they teach. So at present, we've got roughly 1,000 students at the university with devices and roughly 100 members of staff as well. Now, Winchester is quite a small university, so we've got roughly 7,500 students. So having 1,000 of those with iPads is quite a big chunk of our student body. Now, in order to measure how effective these devices were being, or the use of these devices was being to impact the students' learning, we conducted a number of surveys. So the students take part in a survey at the end of every semester. We've run focus groups with students, and we've also done a number of interviews with staff members as well. But for me, one of the most useful things has to actually been to go into classes and see these devices in action. And so I just wanted to share with you some examples that I thought were really quite good practice. Now, to start with, nearly all of the programs have been relying heavily on polling apps, so things like Kahoot, Poll Everywhere, and Socrative. They've been using these apps in order to engage the students and increase engagement in often what can be quite sterile kind of lecture situations. But there are some individual uses as well, which I thought were quite interesting. So in our law program, the students have been recording themselves just using the standard camera app. They've been recording their performance in moots. in order to use these videos to reflect on their kind of abilities later on and work out what they need to improve. Our primary education team very much like to model good practice in their teaching because they know the students that they're teaching will then go on to become teachers themselves. And so they try, when they're using the devices, to really use them in the best way possible. So, as an example, they've been using a green screen app when teaching foreign languages so that it appears the students are in a French cafe when they're learning things like French. They've also used the AR app, or RASMA, in order to increase the information students have access to. So as an example of that, they went to a local zoo, and there are a number of animals there that often hide or don't come out until it's dark. And so using the Orasma app, they built a little tool so that the students can put their phones, or in this case their iPads, over the information panel against this animal's enclosure, and it will direct them to a video so that if the animal's not there, they can still see how it behaves and how it moves. But one of the best examples, I think, of the use of these devices, and possibly one of the simplest as well, has come from our sport department. So they found that their first-year students sometimes struggled to get to grips with marking criteria and assessments. So what they did is they split the students in one class into small groups, and they gave each group a PDF which had an old assignment in it. So an old submission that was completely anonymized from several years ago. They were also provided with marking criteria, and in their groups they had to act as the marking tutor. So using the tiny PDF editor app on their iPads, they had to go through and mark up the script, and at the end of that process they had to decide on the mark that they were going to give the student. They then went to the front of the class, put their iPad onto the projector, and discussed their decisions, why they'd given this student a certain mark and why they'd picked out certain elements of this assignment. And the tutor was then able to go over the marking criteria with them to really make sure they understood how these marking criteria apply to assessments so they can better understand that for their own work. One of the other things we've done as part of this project is that each program was allocated funds to recruit a student fellow. And Student Fellows is something that we've been running for quite a long time at Winchester now, for a number of years. And it's where staff and students are partnered together to create and then follow through an educational development project. So we actually made it a criteria for the programs that wanted to be part of this project that they had to have a student fellow. And they came up with some really interesting projects and interesting ideas. And these ranged from the Law Student Fellow looking at the use of the Law Trove app, which gives them access to lots of textbooks and quizzes, to see whether it actually increased the amount of reading these students were doing. One of the Primary Education Student Fellows looked at the iPad as a personal development tool for when they were out on placement and how useful it was for recording their experiences and reflecting on their own practice. And we even had an American Studies student look at the app Nearpod as a potential replacement for PowerPoint and trying to get over the death by PowerPoint situation that often occur in lectures and to try and increase interactivity there. So all of these projects will help shape how these programs use the iPads in future years. But it wasn't all smooth sailing with the Student Fellows. The way the scheme normally works is that a staff member or a student will have an idea, they will approach the scheme, and then they will be partnered with an appropriate other. But because we made it a requirement that they had to have these student fellows, and we also said that it has to be to do with the iPads and had to be relevant to their course, we found that the staff and students, the program struggled initially to find an appropriate student to work alongside, and also then it took them a while as well to come up with an idea of a project to work on. And so because of this, the iPilot Student Fellows were a little bit behind the rest of their group, as it were, with regards to these projects. Now, on these projects, the staff and the students are equal partners. They're meant to be equal in the power relationship on these projects, and we often see that reflected in the student reflections that they have to submit as part of this. However, with the iPilot students, we actually noticed that there was a perceived power imbalance, and they still saw the staff members they were working with as being kind of superior in that relationship. And these issues might be why in last year, 16-17, we didn't actually have anyone apply to be an iPilot Student Fellow. So this is something that we're going to look to address in future years. As I mentioned, we've conducted a number of student focus groups. We've done semi-structured interviews with staff members, and we've also conducted student surveys at the end of every semester. Now, these surveys looked to try and discover how students are using digital technology in their personal lives as well as their studies, and we tried to base these questions on the GISC elements of digital literacy. And there were some surprising results from this. Firstly, at the start of the project, we weren't convinced that all of the students having the same device, in this case an iPad, would really have any effect, because a lot of the common apps that we knew these programs were going to use are platform agnostic, or they're available through a web browser. But actually, it turns out all of the students having the same device did make a difference. For starters, although 98% of our students that were part of the iPilot did have a smartphone or an internet-enabled device already, that does mean that 2% don't. And so by them all having this same device, it created a level playing field so that no one was being left out. It also helped staff members integrate the devices into their teaching, because they didn't have to worry about students not having devices or students having different devices, because they knew that if they could get an app on their iPad, the students could also get it on theirs. But one of the really interesting things that came out of this was that students actually regarded their iPads as a professional device. They saw it as a device that was part of their university degree and part of their studies, and they treated it as such. So the students we spoke to, they tended to keep social media and games and things like that to their personal devices and their phones, and then things like Word or other word processors and cloud storage for their studies, they would keep that stuff purely on their iPads. There was a distinction, and the students were treating these devices differently. We're not entirely sure why. This might have been partly due to the introductory talks that the programs gave their students about the use of these devices, or it could have perhaps been the fact that they were branded. You can perhaps just see on the image up there that the iPads were engraved with the university logo on the back, and the students actually viewed this almost as like a badge of honor, like they would buy a university sweatshirt or t-shirt. So that was quite a nice added bonus we weren't necessarily expecting. We found that students were being slightly more creative in the way that they were learning, or at least the way they were recording their learning. It's quite difficult to measure creativity, certainly, but we found that students were taking much more visual recordings of what they were doing. So they were using the camera app to take still images or video recordings of group work instead of just taking notes, which they would have done before. They were also using the devices a lot to organize said group work. So they were using Facebook Messenger as an example of a way of organizing who was going to do which tasks. But what we were also able to do is we were able to benchmark some of these results against the GISC Digital Experience Tracker. And we found that the iPilot students, the students that were given iPads, when compared to the national average, were actually more likely to talk about their studies on social media. They were more likely to access resources on the go, and they were more likely to access additional resources as well. So clearly, something here is working. There were a number of barriers, however, to implementing this project. Firstly, cost is a big factor. These devices aren't necessarily cheap, and especially for a small university like ours, giving 1,000 iPads to students is not necessarily an easy thing to do. There were also some practical limitations. So the students were given a 16 gigabyte device, and we found that these were quickly filling up, especially if they had a number of tutors who wanted them to use a number of different apps. There were also some issues with PowerPoints in rooms as well. We did try and encourage students to make sure that their devices were fully charged for every class they attended, but obviously that's not always possible, and the placement of power sockets sometimes did cause problems. But one of the biggest barriers we found was actually staff digital literacy. So, although the majority of the staff who received an iPad could use it, they could access email on it, they could watch iPlayer on it and all the rest of it, a lot of them struggled with embedding this into the classroom and embedding it into classroom activities. And it wasn't necessarily the courses you'd expect as well. Some of our most digitally literate courses, some of the courses who, their students create apps and websites as part of their degree, their staff were some of the ones who struggled the most with actually embedding these devices into teaching and learning activities. And this was further highlighted because we switched VLEs about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. So we moved from Moodle across to Canvas. And that has further highlighted the fact that we do have some problems with staff digital literacy at the university, and that some of our staff really struggle with some quite fundamental and kind of basic digital skills. So taking this scheme forward then, we're actually moving away from the programmatic approach we've had in previous years, and we're moving to a much more targeted modular scheme, where individual module tutors can apply for their module to be a part of this scheme, and their students and they will receive a loan device for the duration of that module. This means we get over some potential issues with staff who have devices that just sit in their drawers all the time, and it also means we don't have students who have got these devices and turn up to a class expecting to use them and then are disappointed that they're not going to. It also means we can branch out and get more of the university involved, and we can get lots of different programs using devices. Apple has recently discontinued the iPad Mini 2 that we were using, and so we've taken this as an opportunity to move away from Apple and to start using Android devices, which typically tend to be a little bit cheaper as well. Based on the back of this project, I'm going to be creating a mobile devices handbook, which is not necessarily aimed at the staff who are using or are going to be part of this scheme, but it's aimed at staff who are considering using students' own devices in the classroom, and it's going to give them some advice about how to create appropriate tasks and how to go about using student devices more. We're also working on a digital literacy strategy for the university to try and address some of the issues that have been raised and to try and upskill staff and also provide extra information and training for our student body as well. So that's where the scheme is going to in the future, and hopefully it continues to be a success. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Any questions?
Thank you for that. It was really interesting. When it came to the practicalities of downloading apps, how did students do that via the sort of YouTube store? Did they have to all have their own Apple ID accounts? How was that managed?
Yes, so what we did is all of the students who were a firm acceptance with us before they arrived, they were contacted and told that they were going to be receiving an iPad as part of their degree program. In there was a list of instructions, and one of those was to create an Apple ID so that as soon as they got the device, they could set it up and start downloading apps. We also tried, where possible, to use apps that were free as well, because we were conscious of students accruing any extra costs, and we wanted to try and avoid that.
I may have missed it when you were talking about the cost. Who's funded the iPads? Does it come centrally within departments, or is it institutionally funded?
It's been institutionally funded. Yeah.
And the buy-in was, how did they get convinced, the people who hold the purse strings, that this is a good thing to do?
There were a number of different things. Looking at increasing digital literacy and trying to break away from what can be a very one-sided kind of lecture environment was part of it. Initially, we thought as well it could be used as a recruitment tool, but unfortunately our funding was never agreed early enough that we could actually use this at open days as a kind of, come to Winchester and get an iPad. Anecdotally, we did hear stories from a couple of students who were very torn about which university to go to. They had two, which they were like, I could go to either of these and be quite happy, and the iPad did help make them choose Winchester. But unfortunately, we were never able to really kind of see how much leverage that would have. Thank you very much.
Okay, next up.
PowerPoint slide, which is always a good place to start. Try not to drop the iPad, which would also be a great place to start. Hi. So, my name is Elizabeth Ellis, and this is my colleague Alice Gallagher. We're here to talk about the experiences we've been having at the Open University, identifying student personas for the development of learning and teaching technology experiences and spaces. And basically, through the presentation, we're going to look at the process that we've gone through identifying those and how they might be useful for the future. So we are based in the Learning Innovation team at the Open University. We sit within the TEL department, and some of you may have heard me talk about our team's methodology at last year's ALTC conference, where we were talking about human-centered design, which we use as a kind of a key, as a key part of our approach. And really, the central part of that is thinking about our students as having insight into developing solutions or developing new ways of doing things, but that they hold the key to the experience. We're a forward-looking team, but we really realized that we had to start getting to grips with our students' experiences now. So, who are they now, and what are the experiences they're having, in order to develop for the future? So, to do that, we designed and ran a survey, asking about those experiences. So, rather than asking them about what they want or what they like, we wanted to find out more about how they behave within the environments that we provide to them. The survey itself was online. We ran it. We had 130 responses, and it was based around this framework with student success at the centre. And here, this is student success as defined by the Open University, which in this case is about around increased attainment, increased progression, and increased retention. And then around student success is what we believe are the key drivers towards that success. So what are the kinds of behaviours that we want to encourage in our students in order for them to be more successful? And in this case, we identified these as participative learning, which we're defining as students being able to contribute third-party materials or sourcing materials themselves, sourcing ideas themselves, and bringing it into the learning that we're providing to them. Learning to learn, which is really about developing those study skills to become ultimately successful. Deeper engagement with learning materials, which is how they go about creating artifacts from the materials we're giving them. Those can be digital or physical, the process that they go through in order to do that. And then collaborative learning, which is obviously the ongoing curse and joy of group work. The survey itself was a mix of quant and qual questions. Qualitative questions were about trying to elicit anecdotal evidence of how they behave and act within the environment that the Open University provides them. That is sometimes blended, but often often online-only environments. And then the quantitative questions were based around a Likert scale, asking them about preferences for different types of technologies and different types of formats, depending on where they are in the study process. So all of that coming together in order to try and understand what that behaviour looks like. And I could wax lyrical about the responses because our students went into great detail exactly how they feel about and exactly how they behave in this environment. We do have this available online, and I do encourage you to go and have a look. It's a really rich piece of data. But in just the highlights, though, for us from the thematic analysis the key behaviours that we identified was students' prioritisation when organising study sessions. So, for instance, some of our students very specific assessment focus. So they identify the question that they're going to have to answer in an exam or in a tutor marked assignment, and then they very specifically plan what they're going to do in order to do that. Some of them are very ad hoc. They've got an hour here, an hour there, whereas others will focus. They may basically prioritise their study sessions in different ways, and then. The artifacts they create and the reasons that they do that. So some of our students are dedicated highlighters and note makers, and some of them are much more they don't make any notes at all, they just read, scan. But all of that is very different. So there's personal reasoning, but also we have found that students who are in STEM, for instance, will often make physical notes, because often they're scribbling formula and they're practicing through that, so that's going through, whereas other students in the humanities areas will be taking notes in a very different way and then synthesizing those very differently. And then what's really interesting for what Alice is going to discuss in a minute, which is boundaries, which is we found from the research that students have very real kind of respect for what they consider respect for what belongs to the Open University and what belongs to them as students, and how they navigate that boundary. And that's really interesting, obviously, for us in this world of co-authoring and co-creation.
Okay, so as Liz said, we had some amazingly rich qualitative data that came back from our students. They told us huge amounts about how they approach their study. We were able to use a thematic analysis to pull out lots of really interesting themes. 60 of the responses we were able to code against a series of sub-themes that we're calling our digital personas. So these are categories of behaviour, attitude and preferences to digital learning. What was really interesting was the lack of overlap that we found. Most responses fitted into one of these categories. So we want to share with you in detail what we discovered in the data. So the first group that came out was what we're calling the digital connectors. So this was the largest group in our particular sample, and these students saw the digital environment primarily as a way of making social connections. The kind of behaviours that they were displaying were they were engaging in forums, they were using our VLE collaborative spaces, but they were also going outside of the OU's VLE provision. They were participating in Facebook groups, very socially connected students. The next group that we found was a slightly smaller group of students. These are what we're calling our digital seekers. These were also students who were very confident using digital tools, but their focus was a bit more on finding information. Was on seeking information rather than making social connections. So, for example, we had a student that told us that they make physical mind maps of the theories that were coming up in their module. They were making connections between them, and then they were going beyond their module materials. They were doing their own research. They were then adding that information into the mind maps. So they were out there looking for the information to start building a picture of the topic that they were studying. Another example that we were given was a student that if they hit a stumbling block in their module, that they would go and research additional tutorials. So we had students who were going on Khan Academy to supplement their learning, those areas that they felt that they needed that little bit of extra help with. We saw a group of students which was a similar size to the digital seekers, which we're calling the Digital as Clutter group. So this group of students, their focus was also on information, but it was the kind of a different response, that they felt overwhelmed by the amount of information that they had at any one time. We were getting comments about how cluttered our websites were, how much information they were bombarded with, and they were the ones that felt the need to kind of simplify their online environment in order to be able to focus on their study, focus on the tasks that they've been given. This was one of the smaller groups in the particular sample that we were looking at. And so like the digital connectors, their focus was on the social connections that you can make in the digital environment, but they saw it more as a distraction. So we had students that were telling us that before they started a study session, they would close down Facebook, they would shut down tabs that weren't relevant to their study, and otherwise they couldn't focus on their study. And those students really felt like studying was a solo activity. That wasn't a group. They weren't interested in group work. They wanted a quiet solo space in order to concentrate. And the final group that came out of this particular set of data was what we're calling those digitally limited students. And this was a very small number of students in this sample, and that's because it was an online survey. But this wasn't to do with attitudes or behaviours or preferences. This was more to do with practical circumstances. Often we have students that live in rural areas that have no broadband, or for economic reasons they can't have broadband at home and can only study in the local library. We also serve students in secure environments. So other students do have obstacles to getting online. And as we move forward with our research and our development into new tools and spaces, we need to be really careful that we're representing those students and that we're making provision for them in the new tools that we'll be working on. So you've heard a little bit about the personas that we found in this particular set of data, and we're really interested to know whether you identify with any of those yourselves. So earlier today we tweeted out a link to this poll. So if you've got a device handy, feel free to go online and give us your input. We're going to leave this link up on the next few slides, so if you want to add your thoughts, it'll be really interesting to see what the Alt-C audience think about this, and we'll be tweeting out the results at the end of the day. So just thinking now a little bit about what's the point of doing this and what use are personas. We tend to use personas at the OU as a part of our design UX type process, but sometimes the personas can be based on a workshop. They can be based on marketing information. They're not always based on really sort of solid evidence. So what we were keen to do is make sure we had this evidence base about the kind of behaviours that real students exhibit that we could then create the personas from that would help in our design processes. I think we all make assumptions about our students, and it was an opportunity to take a step back and think a little bit about the real students that we're serving. And as we think a little bit more about designing new tools and digital spaces, one of the things that really jumped out at us from the data was just how important skills are, good study skills, to success. And we're now kind of posing the question for ourselves around, can we design some new tools that will encourage the development of skills in the way that they're designed? And one of the ways that we want to help shape our thinking and our thought processes and start to build early prototypes about those ideas are using these personas to think about how different types of students with different attitudes, different backgrounds, different capabilities would approach those kind of new tools.
So these are, I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of risks and challenges that we've identified as we've been going through this process. And to be honest, these are two quite open questions for us as well, because we're coming to grips with this as we start to think about these personas and how we can apply them to our work. And the first one is really that designing tools for students is very different to gathering straightforward user requirements, whether if you were developing something that wasn't related to learning and teaching. Because this is an area where often what students want is not necessarily what they need. There's some pretty strong research behind the idea that actually areas of discomfort and areas of challenge actually represent a better learning experience and contribute to better outcomes in the end. But when we involve students directly in the development of tools, platforms, ideas, helping them extrapolate into the future of what a student like them might need 2, 3 to 5 years from now, it's very difficult for them to do that, and that's legitimately difficult for any of us to do. But that's something that's really jumped out at us. So when we're designing for the future, we're really trying to think about students and people, because people change, people evolve, and this is about how we're trying to accommodate that. And by basing this on very kind of sound behavioural evidence of what they do now, it means that we're slightly more secure and confident going forward. Which leads us to the second point, which is the idea of oversimplifying personas to becoming labels, and we know how damaging labels are, and particularly relating to students where they cling to a label and then you have to use dynamite to try and blow that apart. And that's really something that we need to tease out, because is it dodgy to not tell them that these personas exist in the background and that we might be thinking about using that for development? Is there any benefit to sharing that with them? And that's really something that we're having to grapple with and decide about ourselves as we go forward, because it's very much a living piece of research. It's evolving as we go, and Alice is going to talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, so these themes that emerged from our initial survey we think are really interesting, and we want to follow up and see if we can find out a bit more about our students and their behaviour. We've had some feedback from our colleagues who have we've asked a similar question about, do you identify with any of these personas? And the kind of feedback we've been getting is yes, but in different situations. Sometimes these things are context specific. And the other feedback, or the other thing that we're aware of, is just how small the sample is of our initial survey. So at the moment, we're now designing a follow-up survey to validate these findings. This is a survey that's going to go out to thousands of students rather than hundreds. We're designing a series of statements so that we can analyse using a cluster analysis. So what we want to do now is take all these characteristics that have emerged from this initial survey, throw it all up in the air and see where it lands. Do these groups still exist? Are they different in different contexts? Are they different as you move through your study at different levels? How nuanced is it? And this is the first stage in a series of research activities that we've got over the next year, where we're really thinking about student behaviours, really trying to understand our students so that we can start to design new tools for the future that help our students succeed by picking up on what they do now, why they do it, what their learning processes are, and find we can design intuitive new tools for them. So I'm hoping we'll be back here this time next year to tell you all the interesting things we've been finding out. Yeah, that's just...
I was just wondering, because you have such a wealth of data, it seems, these different personas, how much do you think they overlap with other categories? For example, it immediately came to my mind, those who see the digital as clutter more, would you think they'd be more, let's say, surface learners? Are they less independent learners who need more direction? These kind of things.
Well, I think you've pretty much put your finger on the pulse there of why we wanted to do the validation, which is that, this is very much, this data really came from the survey. We didn't actually go looking for it. It came from the analysis, which is why it's been so interesting to get to grips with. And one of the questions that we're really asking ourselves and why we want to validate this and as Alice says, throw it up and see what happens, is to understand whether there are additional categories that might exist, but also we haven't yet, is it possible to say out of those categories or personas, is any one of them more successful than anyone else? And if we overlap, actually, what are the characteristics that would most benefit that kind of deeper engagement? So this is that goes back to that original kind of research framework, which is if we think about those as the drivers for student success, what are the characteristics that will back that up? So, so kind of watch this space really. But it is one of those things that's exactly why we're wanting to do the validation.
When you raised the question about obviously labels, and students latch onto them, as do most people. And just, there's kind of two parts. One, I suppose you could maybe just show them the statements, they kind of boil them down so that there isn't that digital something kind of attached to it. But I know you kind of position this to kind of redesign tools, but obviously there's challenges for academics and those involved in design curriculum now of trying to meet the digital capabilities that students need to go into employment. And I wonder whether you thought, you may have said this, but I may have missed it, whether you thought about how the stuff that you found here can feed forward into curriculum design going forward, and how academics might want to think about, if they're involved in curriculum review or redesign assessment, how they might take advantage of some of this.
Yeah, I think we do go through a process of using personas in learning design, but they tend to be just our academics and other support staff just kind of coming up with ideas on the fly in workshops, and we're really keen that we use an evidence-based process to think about real personas. So yeah, absolutely, feeding into the curriculum design process as well as the kind of wider scale of designing new tools in digital spaces.
Because those two things are really connected, because you can't, it's sort of designing tools and platforms that support the curriculum that we develop, which then changes to then, and I think that it's quite an appreciative, we're aiming for quite an appreciative cycle of that, so that it's not one thing being put into something else or it being to service what we're teaching, but rather trying to have one impact the other in a kind of a positive way.